Hey everyone, welcome back. We are going to be taking a deep dive today into the world of Filipina marriage migration.
Oh, yeah.
You might have heard this called the mail order bride industry.
Yeah.
It's a topic that gets thrown around quite a bit. And
Yeah.
we have a really interesting mix of sources for this one. We've got an academic thesis that kind of examines this industry through a
Yeah.
combination of feminist and Marxist theory.
Interesting.
We also have some legal documents and news articles to kind of round things out.
Wow, that's quite a range.
Yeah. And right at the center of all of this is the story of Susana Remerata Blackwell.
Okay.
So yeah, get ready for a deep dive that's going to take us through some pretty fascinating and honestly sometimes troubling territory.
Yeah, you're not kidding. It's definitely not a simple topic. There are a lot of layers here. We're going to be kind of exploring how those individual choices sort of intersect with these powerful economic and cultural forces that are at play. Yeah, for sure. So before we get into Susanna's story, let's just take a step back and define what we even mean by marriage migration.
Good point.
Um, the thesis that we're looking at uses Nicole Constable's definition,
Okay.
which is women moving from poorer countries to wealthier ones, specifically for marriage.
Right. And I think it's important to make a distinction here between the term mail order bride,
Yeah.
which is very much kind of a loaded industry term, and marriage migrant, which centers the focus on the individual woman's experience.
Right, like looking at her side of the story.
Exactly. We want to make sure that we're centering the women in this discussion and not just perpetuating harmful stereotypes.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, let's talk about Susana.
Okay.
She was a young Filipino woman who chose to participate in this industry. But here's the thing. Her background wasn't what you might expect.
Okay.
She wasn't living in poverty. She was educated. She had a supportive family. She even worked in their businesses.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
So that raises the question, why would someone like Susana, with this relative privilege, choose this path? What was she looking for?
Yeah, well, the sources kind of paint a picture of her being driven by a desire for a different kind of life.
Okay.
Not just for economic reasons,
Right.
but for a chance at what she perceived as modernity, a chance to
Yeah, that makes sense.
have more opportunities.
So it was more about a change in lifestyle than just purely financial need.
It seems that way. And she actually said in one of the articles that she wanted a life where she didn't sweat day and night
Wow.
and could have beautiful children who would be stronger with American blood.
That's pretty powerful language.
Yeah, it is. It really gets to the heart of those aspirations and perceived opportunities that are associated with the West.
Right. And it's a good reminder that the motivations for marriage migration are complex.
Right.
And they go way beyond just simple economic need.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not always just about escaping poverty.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder how those aspirations are shaped by things like media portrayals of the West, you know?
For sure.
Okay, so back to Susana's story. She married an American man named Timothy Blackwell,
Okay.
but the relationship was very short-lived, and he ended up demanding reimbursement for his so-called investment in her.
Wow. What?
Yeah, and tragically, Susana was murdered.
Oh my gosh. That's awful.
Yeah.
Just a heartbreaking case that really highlights the very real dangers that women in this industry face.
Yeah.
Even those who, might appear to have more agency at the outset.
Right.
And this kind of leads us to a concept that the thesis introduces
Okay.
called consensual trafficking.
Consensual trafficking.
Right.
That seems contradictory. How can something be both consensual and exploitative?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
It really challenges our traditional understanding of consent.
Mhm.
It forces us to acknowledge that
Right.
women like Susanna may choose to participate in this system, but that choice is often being made within a context of these profound power imbalances.
Yeah.
Think of it like this. You might agree to a job with terrible pay and terrible working conditions because you desperately need the money.
Yeah.
You're technically consenting to it,
Sure.
but the power dynamic is clearly completely skewed.
Right. It's like you're choosing the best option from a limited set of really bad options.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole thing so complex.
Yeah.
We can't just dismiss these women's choices as naive or foolish.
Right.
We need to understand the systemic forces that are at play here that limit their options
Right.
and make them vulnerable to exploitation.
So how does that power imbalance play out specifically in the context of Filipina marriage migration?
Well, to understand that, we need to look at the historical and cultural context.
Okay.
We can't ignore the legacy of U.S. colonization in the Philippines
Right.
and how that continues to shape perceptions even today.
So we're talking about the power dynamics between the U.S. and the Philippines.
Yes.
But also the power dynamics between men and women.
Yes, absolutely. And this is where a concept called racial castration comes in.
Racial castration. That sounds intense. What does that even mean?
Yeah, it's a term coined by scholar David Ng.
Oh, okay.
Essentially, it describes how Filipino men
Okay.
have been historically feminized in Western culture,
Okay.
seen as less masculine or assertive. And ironically, this makes Filipino women more desirable to some American men who are looking for what they perceive as traditional, more submissive wives.
Wow. So there's this kind of double standard where Filipino women are seen as more desirable because
Yes.
Filipino men are perceived as less so.
Right. And it's important to remember that these perceptions are not just random. They're deeply rooted in historical power dynamics and
Yeah,
stereotypes.
these perceptions have been around for a long time.
Exactly. They're passed down through generations, through media,
Yeah.
through all sorts of cultural narratives. And this directly fuels the desire for a traditional wife, someone who will fulfill a specific, often subservient role within the household.
So on the one hand, you have these American men seeking out Filipino women because of these stereotypes. But on the other hand, Filipino women may also desire the modernity and opportunities they associate with the West. It seems like a really complicated mix of desires and perceptions.
It is. It's not a simple equation. It's about power, cultural perceptions, and individual aspirations colliding in this very specific context.
Yeah, and to really understand how those aspirations actually translate into action, I think we need to take a closer look at the economic forces that are at play here.
Totally. Let's dig into that.
Okay, so we've talked about history, culture, stereotypes. Now let's dive into the economic side of things.
Okay.
The thesis uses this term, human capital, to describe how Filipino brides are viewed within this marriage market.
Right. It might sound a bit clinical, but it's really helpful to kind of illustrate how these women are often seen as assets,
Okay.
almost like investments within this system.
Commodities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this kind of ties back to our discussion of consensual trafficking, right? It's about how their domestic and sexual labor is essentially assigned a monetary value.
So it's not just about finding love or a better life, but also about fulfilling a specific economic role within the marriage.
Right. The sources suggest that American men often see this as an initial investment. They're paying agency fees, travel expenses, all that. And they expect a return on that investment primarily through the wife's domestic and sexual labor.
It's like they're purchasing a service and they expect that service to be delivered. That feels pretty dehumanizing, to be honest.
It is. It's a pretty stark illustration of how deeply capitalism can penetrate even the most intimate aspects of our lives.
Right.
Shaping relationships and expectations in ways we might not even realize. The thesis actually connects this to Karl Marx's theory of surplus value.
Oh, yeah, Marx. That's some dense stuff.
Yeah.
Can you break down surplus value for me in a way that connects to this?
Sure. Okay, so let's say a husband spends $10,000 to find a Filipina bride.
Okay.
Over the next 5 years, her domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, childcare saves him $25,000 that he would have otherwise spent on hiring help. That difference, the $15,000 that's the surplus value, her work is generating more value than the initial investment.
Wow, that's a really clear way to understand it. So the wife's labor becomes a source of profit for the husband.
Exactly. Kind of
Yeah.
unsettling when you think about it in those terms, right? But it helps us understand the economic logic at play here.
It does. So we've talked about the economic side, but what does that return on investment actually look like
Right.
in terms of the labor involved?
Well, this is where feminist scholars have kind of expanded Marx's theory to include gendered and sexual labor.
Right.
Something that Marx himself largely ignored.
Because things like cooking, cleaning, childcare, they don't really fit into that traditional definition of labor.
Right.
But it's absolutely work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's work that's often undervalued and invisible, especially within a marriage. Feminist scholars argue that this kind of labor needs to be recognized and valued,
Yeah.
particularly in the context of marriage migration.
So how does all of this connect back to Filipina marriage migration specifically?
Well, the thesis explores this concept of modes of reproduction.
Modes of reproduction.
Yeah, it sounds complicated, but basically it refers to how capitalism impacts family structures and women's roles within those structures.
Okay, so give me an example. What do you mean by modes of reproduction?
Okay, think about those traditional family structures, like a factory production line.
Okay.
You have specific roles. The husband is the breadwinner, the wife is the homemaker, and everyone has their designated tasks.
Okay, I can see that.
But modern conveniences like washing machines and daycares have disrupted that production line.
So you're saying that those conveniences have changed the nature and value of domestic labor?
Exactly. Think about it. Back in the day, housework was incredibly time-consuming.
Right.
But now, with those modern conveniences, women have more time,
Yeah.
more opportunities to participate in the paid workforce.
And this raises some interesting questions about the expectations placed on Filipina brides. Are they expected to fulfill that traditional stay-at-home wife role, even as those roles are changing in Western societies?
It creates this tension between the traditional wife ideal that some American men see
Right.
and the reality of modern life, where those traditional roles are shifting.
And we have to remember that Susana Remerata's story unfolded in the early 1990s,
Right.
a time when those shifts were already well underway.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
even though she was seeking a different life, she was also entering this marriage market with these evolving
Yeah.
and sometimes conflicting expectations about gender roles and the value of domestic labor.
This all feels so complicated. History, economics, changing social norms. It makes you wonder how much choice anyone really has in this system.
You're hitting at a really crucial point.
Right.
And I think to further explore those limitations of choice, we need to kind of shift gears and talk about the legal aspects of this industry.
Okay, so are there laws in place to protect these women? Do those laws work?
Well, there are laws, both in the Philippines and the U.S., but their effectiveness is definitely debatable. In the Philippines, you have Republic Act 6955.
Okay.
It's also known as the Anti-Mail Order Bride Law.
So that sounds pretty straightforward. What does it do?
It prohibits the advertisement of Filipino women for marriage to foreigners. They also have Republic Act 9208, the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act,
Okay.
which is designed to prevent the exploitation of vulnerable people, including in the context of marriage.
So on paper, it looks like they're taking steps to address the issue.
Right.
But I have a feeling it's not that simple.
You're right. The thesis points out that these laws have limitations. For example, that anti-mail order bride law has been criticized for driving the industry underground instead of actually stopping it.
Okay.
And the definition of trafficking in their anti-trafficking law doesn't fully capture those complexities of consent that we talked about earlier.
Right, because consensual trafficking shows us that these women may choose to participate,
Right.
but that choice is made within a system that's inherently unequal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That nuance is often lost in these legal definitions and frameworks. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
So what about the U.S.? Do they have any laws that specifically address this?
They do. In 2005, the U.S. passed the International Marriage Broker Regulation Act,
Okay.
or IMBRA for short.
What does MBRA do? Does it actually protect women?
Well, its main goal is to provide foreign fiancés and spouses who are immigrating to the U.S. with information about their legal rights.
Okay.
It also requires marriage brokers to disclose any criminal or domestic violence history of their American clients.
So it sounds like it's more about informing these women and giving them some tools to protect themselves rather than preventing the exploitation from happening in the first place.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that IMBRA wasn't passed until 2005.
Right.
So it wouldn't have applied to women like Susana who came to the U.S. before then.
Right. And even though IMBRA is a step in the right direction, it doesn't really address those root causes of the industry.
Yeah.
The economic inequalities, the cultural stereotypes, the power imbalances that make these women vulnerable in the first place.
Yeah, it seems like legislation is always playing catch up,
Right.
trying to address the symptoms rather than the underlying causes.
Like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
Exactly.
It feels like we've uncovered more questions than answers.
It always happens that way, doesn't it?
And I think that's the nature of a deep dive, right? Peeling back the layers of a complex issue, it's rarely neat and tidy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think to really grapple with the implications of everything we've discussed, we need to kind of shift our focus from the systemic to the personal.
All right, deep divers. We've made it to the final part of our exploration into Filipina marriage migration. We've covered a lot of ground: definitions, personal stories, historical context, economic theories, legal frameworks.
It's been quite a journey. And what's really striking is how interconnected all of these different threads are. They weave together to form a tapestry that's both intricate and honestly quite disturbing.
It's definitely not a simple story of victims and villains, right? It's this nuanced intersection of economics, cultural desires, individual choices, sometimes even conflicting desires within the same person.
Exactly. It's easy to jump to conclusions, but the reality is far more complex. And Susana Remerata Blackwell's story, as tragic as it is, offers such a valuable window into this world.
Yeah, her story really stayed with me. It raises so many questions about agency commodification, how gender roles are evolving within these capitalist societies that we live in. It makes you think.
It does. And for me, one of the biggest takeaways from Susana's story and from this whole deep dive, really, is that Filipino marriage migration isn't a monolithic thing. There's no single narrative that encompasses everyone's experience.
Right. Everyone has their own story.
Exactly. There are so many different motivations at play. Economic pressures, aspirations for a better life, even genuine desires for love and connection. It's not always just about one thing.
And we can't forget that historical and cultural context that we talked about, the legacy of U.S. colonization, the way Filipino men are often feminized in Western culture, and how that fuels the desire for a traditional wife in the minds of some American men.
Right. All of those factors play a huge role in shaping this whole industry.
Yeah. And then there's that really thought-provoking concept of consensual trafficking, which I think challenges us to look beyond those easy answers.
It definitely makes you question some assumptions.
Yeah, it forces us to recognize that someone can make a choice, even a seemingly empowered choice, within a system that is designed to exploit them.
It makes you wonder what consent really means in these situations.
Exactly. It's not always as clear-cut as we'd like to think.
And it reminds us that consent doesn't just erase those power imbalances at play. We have to look at that broader context, the systemic forces that are shaping those choices.
It also makes you think about how economic forces can influence our choices, even in areas like love and marriage, which we often think of as being purely personal.
Right? It's like capitalism seeps into every corner of our lives, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah, and we can't forget about the legal landscape either. We talked about laws like IMBRA, which have good intentions but often fall short of truly protecting these women.
Unfortunately, it seems like legislation is always playing catch-up, trying to address the symptoms of a problem rather than the underlying causes.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a question for all of you listening.
Okay.
How does this idea of consensual trafficking challenge your understanding of consent, exploitation, and individual agency? And how do these dynamics play out in other areas of our lives?
It's a question worth sitting with, I think. It prompts us to examine not only the choices that people make, but also the systems that shape those choices. Because ultimately, that's where real change needs to happen.
That's a powerful thought to end on. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.